In this video, we will explore the oil economies of the world's top 6 oil producers. Oil is the lifeblood of the modern world. Though renewable energy is becoming more prominent, oil still accounts for over a third of the world's total energy production. Since oil is so important, oil-rich countries frequently command a disproportionate amount of political and economic power. In many cases, oil accounts for a large fraction of the country's gross domestic product. Though around 100 countries produce oil, just 5 of those account for half of the world's total crude oil production, and 14 make up nearly 94% of the proven oil reserves globally. Before we dive in, make sure you don't miss our next video and subscribe with the button down below. Number 6. Iraq. 4.4 million barrels per day. As one of the founding members of OPEC, Iraq produces just 4.4 million barrels of oil per day. But that is still enough to fuel every flight in the world for over 4 days. Iraq also maintains the world's 5th largest oil reserve, with 147 billion barrels worth nearly $16 billion. Unfortunately, its oil production has been impeded by military conflict, sanctions, and political upheaval. While Iraq has had a difficult time fully realizing revenues, oil is responsible for over 65% of its gross domestic product and over 99% of the Iraqi government's revenues. Number 5. China. 4.8 million barrels per day. Though China has the world's largest economy, its oil production is minuscule comparatively. China produces nearly 5 million barrels of oil per day, which is 5% of the world's oil production. Because of its size relative to oil production, China still imports a significant amount of oil. The country consumes nearly 14 million barrels per day, which makes it the second largest oil consumer in the world, accounting for 14% of global consumption. Many of these Chinese oil fields have matured and have already peaked. Therefore, the Chinese government is investing large sums into new techniques that are expected to improve oil production in the coming years, but that also comes at a steep cost increase per barrel. While China is the world's 5th largest oil producer, the industry accounts for less than 1% of its massive gross domestic product. Number 4. Canada. 5.5 million barrels per day. The frosty northern nation of Canada produces 5.5 million barrels of oil per day, which is the equivalent of 5 million standard American bathtubs. Though this accounts for 5% of global production, Canada is considered a single-client oil producer. It exports nearly 98% of its crude oil to its neighboring nation, the US. Canada is expected to double its oil production by 2050, but the topic of future exports is considered a political hot potato with the expansion of the Keystone XL oil pipeline, which plans to deliver oil to the US. The increased production would likely be a result of oil sands production extraction methods, which are costly. However, new technology is expected to significantly lower costs. Canada is one of the wealthiest nations in the world, in part due to both its oil exports and reserves. Canada boasts the world's 3rd largest proven oil reserves with 171 billion barrels. That is enough to sustain the world's oil consumption for over 13 years. The country reported 2020 earnings of around $10 billion from its oil and natural gas sector, and provided $105 billion to Canada's gross domestic product in 2020. Number 3. Russia. 11 million barrels per day. Russia is a massive transcontinental country twice the size of the United States. Despite its large stature, Russia's oil production is half that of the US. Regardless, Russia is still the 3rd largest oil producer in the world, exporting 11 million barrels per day, which accounts for 11% of the world's daily oil consumption. The country's daily export of oil could sustain the entire continent of Africa for 3 days. Though oil exports fell in 2020, oil was still the 2nd largest Russian export and represents 26% of its exports. The oil industry was privatized following the fall of the Soviet Union. However, it was reverted back to state control a few years later. It's estimated that Russian oil exports amounted to nearly $73.4 billion in 2020, which accounts for around 30% of the country's gross domestic product. Number 2. Saudi Arabia, 11.01 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia is a country that is almost synonymous with oil production. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was historically the largest exporter of crude oil until 2017, when the US overtook it for the top spot. With over 11 million barrels produced daily, Saudi Arabian oil represents 12% of global oil exports in 2020. To put that into perspective, Saudi Arabia's daily oil export could fill nearly 2,550 Olympic-sized swimming pools. For a country the size of Alaska, that's no small feat. Unless U.S. oil exports dramatically fall, it's unlikely that Saudi Arabia will overtake the number 1 spot in the near future due to the restrictions from the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, to which it belongs. Oil and gas account for between 42 to 50% of the country's gross domestic product and 90% of its export earnings. The state oil firm, Saudi Aramco, manages the majority of oil exports and reported a net income of $88 billion in 2019 and $49 billion in 2020. To put that into perspective, they make 1/4 of Bill Gates' lifetime fortune in 1 year. While Saudi Arabia may have fallen behind the United States in oil exports, the small country's oil reserves are 6 times larger, holding a cool 268 billion barrels. Saudi Arabia has the second largest oil reserves in the world and possesses 17% of the world's proven oil reserves. Number 1. The United States, 18.6 million barrels per day. The U.S. oil market is frequently referred to as a swing producer. This is because its production varies with supply and demand. However, within the last few years, the United States has become the largest exporter of oil in the world. With 18.6 million barrels of oil produced per day in 2020, the U.S. accounts for 20% of global oil exports. While that is undoubtedly large, it may be difficult to conceptualize. If you were to lay the 18.6 million barrels end to end, it would make a total of 6,435 miles. That is a nice road trip across the US, stretching from Seattle to Los Angeles to Chicago to Miami, from Miami to New York City, and from New York City to Cleveland. The US increased its oil production by 500% within the last few years by implementing new and innovative drilling techniques. Horizontal drilling and fracking have been particularly effective, though they remain controversial due to their environmental impact. The U.S.'s annual revenue from the oil and gas industry netted $181 billion and accounts for between 8 to 10% of the U.S.'s $19.5 trillion gross domestic product. For perspective, educational, healthcare, and social services combined netted just 8% of the U.S.'s GDP. While the U.S. has recently become one of the world's top exporters, it has long been the greatest consumer of oil worldwide. In fact, the U.S. economy consumes over 20% of the world's 99 million barrels of oil per day, and now heavily depends on its oil production to maintain the current consumption rate long term. It's also in the top 10 countries with the most oil reserves, with 42 billion proven barrels in 2018, which is enough to sustain global consumption for over 11 years. Oil powers our world. From planes, trains, factories, and more, the world runs on oil. As a result, oil also powers modern economies. While you might not think that much about the oil you use in your daily life, the oil and gas sector represents over 2% of the entire world's gross domestic product. Which country's oil production were you most surprised by? Tell us in the comments below. If you like this video, make sure you hit that like button and check out our next video right here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.